Welcome to the Empire Files. There's a very important new international legal effort to hold Israel accountable for its genocide in Gaza. I'm joined by Varsha Gandikota, chair of the Hague Group, and Chrispin, spokesperson for the Foreign Minister of South Africa. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining me on the Empire Files. Varsha, talk about what the Hague Group is and why it was formed.
Yeah, the Hague Group, really the conversations around it began at the 1-year mark of the genocide against the Palestinian people, with this recognition that surely this could not possibly still be going on. As one of the lawyers in the South African case at the ICJ said, this is the first genocide in history where its victims are broadcasting their destruction to our phones and televisions in real time live. And still a year in, we saw the same continuing and in fact having accelerated to unimaginable levels. And in response, every time there's been a plea, a demand, we've seen no response, right? There's no point asking the United States to do something that we know it will not do. There's no point issuing letters and demands to the Israeli government to do things that we know it will not do. So surely, as the world, we had to find other ways to respond that also went beyond our existing international institutions, because we tried using them. We tried using the International Court of Justice, getting a ruling that does rule that the last many decades of Israel's occupation of Palestine is blatantly illegal and sets out specific legal obligations of every state in order to ensure the end of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And still, we've seen no response. We've seen a brazen defiance from multiple European nations. We see the ruling from the International Criminal Court come out in November 2024 against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. And once again, we see either countries coming up, making up rules about impunity and immunity for heads of state, or openly questioning and challenging the jurisdiction of the court, or simply declaring that they would not follow the court's orders and giving Netanyahu, say, a stage in Switzerland. So in that context, where what we thought was obvious is no longer obvious, what we thought was sacred is no longer sacred, we've been forced to ask, how can we, at both the international level and at the national level, through collective action, very, very materially cut off the arteries of the genocidal machine. So the Hague Group is made up of 9 nations from 3 continents, Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa and Asia, coming together, which, by the way, is only an inaugural moment for us. We by no means believe that this is the limit of the number of countries who can commit to these measures, but it's only a demonstration of what is possible by collective action, where we coordinate our legal and diplomatic measures in order to curtail Israel's violations of international law that are currently being backed up by the United States and European nations and unable to be stopped by the international institutions that we have set up today.
There's diplomatic, economic, and political measures that these countries are taking to try to ensure that Israel is held accountable to international law. Can you talk about what those are?
Certainly. I think Varsha can speak to the measures specifically, but the idea is quite a big idea and a simple idea, is to commit to international law. In a time where international law is severely under attack, the idea of just committing to it and saying we will act consistently with our obligations is what is quite significant about this group. And that is why South Africa is part of it, because international law is a fundamental pillar of our foreign policy. And we do believe that it's important to act consistently with it. And of course, you have these countries who are the subalterns of the legal world, right? According to the West, these are the countries that the international law was created for. We've inherited these institutions from the West, and suddenly we are the ones who are using these institutions the way they should be used. So the fact that we are committed to doing so is a very big political commitment and is quite a significant political commitment.
So we began with what might seem like a very obvious response, which is we'll simply follow the letter of the law. We, as nations party to the Rome Statute, will uphold the ICC warrants. Those not party to the Rome Statute will still recognize that we have obligations under the International Court of Justice and will do everything, including persecution and investigation on our domestic soil, to ensure accountability for war crimes. And the second measure from the Hague Group is on no transfer of arms or war weapons. So essentially saying you cannot use our factories and our lands in order to build weaponry to be used against our brothers and sisters in Palestine in the genocide conducted by Israel. And the third is a refusal of ports, no harbor for genocide. So once again, countries coming together to say you cannot use our ports for vessels carrying jet fuel or weaponry to Israel, once again to be used against the Palestinian people.
I mean, you mentioned before just the basic notion of just adhering to the law and how that is seen as something radical and, warrants all of these attacks and threats. But it's literally just the most basic thing you can do. Apply the law blindly.
Yeah, and that's really our commitment just to the law itself. It cannot be that it's a just law when it's required to persecute African leaders, but when it's required to prosecute Western leaders, suddenly it's a preposterous idea. We really, really need to make this plain. It's international law that is on the line. It is the multilateral system that is on the line. And these are institutions, like I said earlier, that we've inherited from the West. These are the systems that we're told this is what the rules-based system entails. So we cannot afford for the system to be at all hypocritical and endorse a system that ensures that there's impunity for some. We really, really want to say that if there is a rule of law, if the system is indeed rules-based, based on international law, then it mustn't have eyes. It must truly be blind, whether it's a European or an African violating the principles of international law and international law. It's all in all its manifestations. Then that must be justly adjudicated by a competent authority. And that's all we've done. We've appealed to the institutions that we have created. And we must continue to do so because we truly, and this is how we were brought up, we truly believe that the Palestinian people's oppression is our oppression. And until they are not oppressed, we ourselves are still oppressed. In other words, our freedom is incomplete. And that's something we'll continue to pursue because at the core of being South African, by the way, is a very, very simple saying of Ubuntu. The saying is, Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. I am a person because you are. And the moment your humanity is destroyed, the moment your dignity is taken away, I lose a part of me, I become less human. And we need to build a world where we recognize each other's humanity, we are committed to each other's lived shared prosperity. We think that would be a just world. But how we get there is ensuring that the institutions that we have built, and in our case inherited, work the way they should. The rules that we put on the paper, the glossy buildings that Varsha refers to, should mean something. They shouldn't be just words on the paper. They should save lives. They should prevent ethnic cleansing. They should prevent genocides, whether in Palestine or in Rwanda. These are things that we cannot live with, and it's something that we should be able to act to prevent. And if we're being persecuted for preventing a genocide, then if that's what justice is, then we are on the right side of justice.
Varsha, a lot of countries I would have expected to join are not on the list, particularly those that have been very vocal about Israel's genocide in Gaza. How much of a factor do you think repercussions from the U.S. are in preventing these countries from joining?
Yeah, I think it's a huge concern because we've seen punishment being meted out from the United States government well before President Trump's sanctions on the ICC of 6th February last week. If you look at what happened when South Africa brought its historic genocide convention case against Israel at the beginning of last year, we saw that the United States House of Representatives immediately responded by introducing legislation to put all bilateral relations with South Africa of the United States under review. 6 months later, when a country in Europe, supposedly part of the North Atlantic Alliance, Spain decides to not let its ports be used to transfer arms, weapons, and other military equipment to be used against the Palestinian people. And again, the United States responds, this time under the guise of foreign trade, by opening an investigation that could levy something close to $2.3 million per voyage. And that investigation is still open, by the way. And of course, we're now seeing much more brazen, open, belligerent threats. I think here it's worth mentioning the bill that hasn't gone through. It's been blocked in the Senate now, but was passed in the US House, which was much broader than just the ICC sanctions against the institution and its staff now, which was so broadly worded as to involve any and all individuals and their family members who advocated for or endorsed support for ICC investigations into US and its allies, that they would have their visas revoked from the United States, have permanent bans imposed on them, and that their financial assets would be seized. Now, that bill very well may still go through, or perhaps find its way into yet another executive order of President Trump. And I think that has real chilling effect across the globe, because as we know from looking at the votes at the United Nations General Assembly, these three measures are only an excerpt, in fact, a small excerpt of a much longer list of legal obligations of states under the ICJ ruling that well over 129 nations signed on to and adopted with a majority in the General Assembly. So ideally, you would be seeing 129 nations be part of the Hague Group and implementing these measures at the national level through legislation. But that disparity between what they've committed to in principle within the halls of the UN and what they're willing to be, what there's appetite to do in the political sphere right now, has to do very much with the fear of punishment from the United States.
Absolutely. I mean, I think people were so optimistic once these charges were filed at the ICJ, especially after the arrest warrants were issued against Israeli leaders. But as you mentioned, I mean, the belligerent response from Israel, I mean, not only refusing to comply with the ICJ directive, but then you have a sitting president issuing sanctions against all of the court's members, their families. You have sitting senators actually threatening to invade The Hague, literally. Mr. Phiri, what is your response to particularly the U.S. efforts to just totally delegitimize your government's initiative here and also just threaten, I mean, actually threaten invasion and of course, the sanctions that we've seen?
These are direct attacks on international law itself, but also they're attacks on the countries that have signed up to the Rome Statute. At the end of the day, it's the countries that are signatories to the Rome Statute that have to enforce warrants and rulings of the ICC. So at the end of the day, what you're seeing here actually is 125 member states being sanctioned effectively. And it's a shame. It's a downright shame that these countries are being sanctioned solely to ensure that an ally of the United States is immune from international law. We think that that's something that is contrary to what the US stands for itself. Apparently, it's a country of the rule of law, a country of justice. But justice must not have eyes. The rule of law must not have eyes. And here you have an opportunity to ensure that justice is seen to be done and is being done. But alas, the courts are being prevented from doing their jobs. And it's a really, really big indictment on the parties who are acting in this manner.
These Western powers have created these institutions ostensibly to protect human rights and international law, and they're just being made a mockery of. I mean, these countries are much more concerned with criminalizing pro-Palestine speech and journalism than they are with stopping genocide. How crazy is it to just be delegitimized, I mean, by the US and Israel? I mean, to blanketly deny these claims, this mounting body of evidence for war crimes, and then just to say, nope, the accusations are completely baseless and, in fact, are anti-Semitic.
One of the things that we said when we filed the case is that, it's not good enough to just label our case as anti-Semitic or baseless. You really have to prove and bring evidence that it is indeed baseless. And I think our case really speaks for itself. We saw the evidence that was presented by our incredible legal team in the ICJ. The world was riveted by what they saw. The prime minister's words, the minister's words spoke for themselves. Genocidal in nature, very deliberate in targeting innocent civilians, very deliberate in cutting off humanitarian aid, very deliberate in making their objective clear that this is ethnic cleansing.
How did you learn from your country's own lessons in order to help your team craft this argument?
We know apartheid when we see it. And what we're seeing in Gaza is probably worse than apartheid. It is apartheid on steroids, but also it is a very, very clear, direct intention to ethnically cleanse Gaza of Palestinians. And it's something that we felt we are obliged to prevent in terms of the Genocide Convention, and which is something we've signed up to do domestically as well in our own law. So this was an obligation that we took up because we didn't want to be right. We didn't want to see yet another genocide in the world happening, and the world watches on happily. Just not far from South Africa, we had Rwanda, where there was a genocide taking place at a time where our democracy was in a deep transition, or our country rather was in a deep transition from an apartheid state into a democracy. And at the time, the world stood by and did nothing. And we all live with that regret, where we saw thousands of people being killed in Rwanda. And it's a regret we all live with today. We don't want to live with another genocide. We don't want to live with another regret, as we are seeing in Gaza. But unfortunately, everything that we predicted in that case has materialized. Everything that we said would happen has materialized in Gaza. And today, Gaza is in epic ruins. Innocent civilians, women and children's lives are ruined irreparably. And it's something that really should haunt all of us and haunt all of humanity for time immemorial.
And I think that's what's so deeply frustrating about this entire situation is, I mean, the length of time, obviously, that these proceedings take. I mean, naturally, I mean, it's not something that happens overnight. Justice is, it takes a while for accountability. But to see Israel just flagrantly, just brazenly violating the ICJ directive, I mean, in the face of just everything that is right and moral and just, and then the U.S. just completely backing Israel, as well as all of its junior collaborators across Europe. It is just unbelievable because there's nothing that we can do further than what countries like you are doing, and actions like the Hague Group is doing, to stand alone and just saying, we agree with international law. I mean, is that such a crazy, radical notion? And just the mockery that's been made from Western powers, that, again, these institutions that were created after World War II to try to prevent these atrocities. So the frustration of seeing someone like Netanyahu, casually telling Biden, well, you guys dropped a nuke, so why can't we carpet bomb an area? And Biden's just like, I don't know. Good point you made there. I mean, it's really unbelievable in the year 2025 that we're seeing such egregious crimes against humanity being committed daily on our phones, live streamed to us, and it just feels like we are greatly helpless. And that is what is so motivating and inspiring. Varsha, can you talk about the significance of the global South in trying to uphold the sanctity of these institutions, given the fact that they've mostly notably been used against, African countries in the past and kind of created ostensibly to protect human rights by the same institutions that are violating them?
Yeah, this is a story that Chrispin and I often relate when we're asked about our time at the ICJ. When you enter the International Court of Justice, for instance, the Peace Hall in The Hague, it's a beautiful building and it's a beautiful room, and it has these stained glass windows kind of surrounding the entire room. Supposedly a $1 million donation from Andrew Carnegie that display this evolution of the peace ideal, and what that's supposed to be is internal external adjudication as progress, and this idea of the legal conscience of the Western world, very much written so in these terms, legal conscience of the civilized world, being brought to nations that are in these stained glass windows, still stuck in primitivity. And that really is the origins of a lot of these institutions, right? And it's quite odd, of course, for me, certainly as an Indian, to be on the South African side of the aisle in that room and thinking neither of our countries and neither of us could see ourselves in these stained glass windows, right? Bringing this ideal of progress to the world. So I do think a lot of the shock that we're seeing right now and the real kind of offense is because the global South has dared to bring a Western nation and implicitly its backers, other Western nations, to court and to account for the very same laws that have been for time immemorial used against leaders and governments of the global South. Here we have to remember that the US's opposition to the ICC has not been universal. So it's only when it's used against itself to hold it account to the very same laws and the very same values that it then exposed to the world that the United States says, no, that's where we draw the line. What's significant about the Hague Group is that these 9 nations who you see, some very big, but a lot of them also small and smaller in terms of their economic strength and their ability to withstand punishment from the United States or from the West or from other European nations. They are the ones that have stuck their neck out from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And none of these 9 nations are ones with direct geopolitical interest in the crisis right now that's going on. Then Israel-Palestine for them is not a national security question, is not an existential border question. So these 9 nations have really come together to form the Hague Group simply to stand for international law, simply to say this is a matter of defense of humanity. And if we let this go, if in this moment we do not stand up for the defense of the Palestinian people and for the right to self-determination, then we will lose the world into darkness. And something that is significant here is that it's no accident that all of these 9 nations come from the global South, because we do see what's happening to the Palestinians today echo dark chapters of our own histories, whether that's military rule or colonialism. We have experienced this form of threat of expulsion, the theft of our lands, and we see that happening yet again in different forms, as Chris has talked about with South Africa and apartheid. And we believe that it is time for us to step in. One thing is on the notion of collective action. The question of United States meting out its punishment is something that's repeated over and over again. And of course, that's important to remember because it shows us the fragility of the international institutions that we've set up today. So of course, you have the United Nations, but the General Assembly ends up only being able to act as an advisory body that's then dismissed, even when a majority of the General Assembly says, yes, the legal obligations of states are to impose all of these measures. And that list of measures is much longer than the 3 measures that the Hague Group has adopted now. But it amounts to nothing when you have a United States sitting on the Security Council that can issue its veto anytime that it chooses to do so. You can have an International Criminal Court issue an order, but it doesn't amount to anything if so many of its member states simply refuse to enforce its orders and say, yeah, we're going to let Netanyahu fly over our airspace. We're going to bring him to Switzerland and give him a stage. We're going to be Poland, Austria, and Hungary that say, we're just simply not going to listen to these warrants and welcome him into our nation. So you really begin to see the complete fragility of the international institutions we've set up now, forcing us to take collective action at the national levels in order to buttress and transform the international institutions so they may finally begin to serve all peoples of the world equally in the true sense in which they should be working.
Mr. Phiri, the context of all of this is that the U.S. has power over these institutions, as we've been talking about. I mean, Trump is now working with Elon Musk, of all people. He's the South African oligarch. Americans right now are feeling the wrath of Musk's ideology. Americans are going to be suffering for years under his domestic agenda, but he has an outsized foreign policy role as well. I mean, he's a defense contractor. He gets billions in subsidies from the U.S. government, and he's extraordinarily close with Netanyahu. Talk about just your thoughts on operating these measures and pursuing this case under this new political landscape.
Well, we're a sovereign state, and our sovereignty was earned on, I don't have to tell you, a great deal of blood. The new South Africa that you see today is a country that is created out of the solidarity of the world, but also out of great sacrifice. And these are principles that we believe in, not because they are attractive or because it looks good, but because they liberated us. And this is our contribution to the world. So whatever actor is out there that believes that they can stunt this belief in South Africans is mistaken. It is a belief that has created South Africa, and it has worked. It's taken a great deal of time. It's still work in progress, but it is a belief we will continue to pursue because it is who we are as South Africans.
And earlier you were talking about kind of this transparency that Trump delivers, which is really just lifting the mask off of the belligerence and the real face of empire. I mean, that Biden was masking in humanitarianism, human rights. I mean, that's what we see with kind of the neoliberal order. But Trump just comes in like a bull in a china shop and just says it like it is, plainly. There's no differentiation whatsoever between Trump's plan and what Democrats were intending to do by giving Netanyahu's cabinet a blank check with the weapons to carry out this genocidal onslaught. Is there anything that you want to add about this, the gravity of this moment, and now kind of coming into this new regime where things are a little bit more transparent about what's happening?
Yeah, it's been quite frustrating to watch a lot of news reports now saying, "Oh, the United States has finally abandoned international law," right after President Trump's coming into office. Of course, this is the United States abandoned international law well before President Trump's sanctions against the ICC of 6th February. What we're seeing now is it taking a giant sledgehammer and actively trying to destroy any semblance of international institutions that we have now, which might be a slight acceleration under President Trump. But certainly for many of us in the global south who have seen this logic of punishment being wielded on us, simply it's the logic of punishment for attempting to liberate ourselves. If you look at history, for example, or even under Biden, of course, he's been with $18 billion funding the genocide, repeating lies about beheaded babies from his official seat in the White House, widely debunked claims. So there is no question at all about this being a continuation of US foreign policy, but only a real clarifying moment in the final iteration of what we may call the mask of empire. Perhaps what's useful about this is that it finally forces European nations that have so far been talking the talk but now walking the walk to have to make a decision, because many of them now don't want to be seen as playing on the same side as President Trump, precisely because he's being so brazen and acting like a bull in a china shop, and now are being forced to say, no, what President Trump's saying is wrong, and how can he attack the ICC, so on and so forth, which earlier, of course, they were much, much more hesitant to kind of break with this, what we may call the North Atlantic Alliance. But what's also useful, I think, is to look at whether this is altogether new, not just in the case of Palestine, but really in terms of US foreign policy. And you see that it's not just in the last year. If you look at Honduras, for example, where our friends like Elon Musk, crypto billionaires from California, who've gone and taken up a whole land to set up micronations of their own. And when the Honduran people say, no, we're actually going to take our land back, and you have to act as yet any other citizen and not run your own empires on our land, they're hit with a lawsuit from Washington, D.C., aided very much by our institutions like the World Bank. You go much further back in history, what's happening with South Africa now, but look at Zimbabwe, for instance. The reason they've been under sanctions for the last 3 decades is because they attempted to do land reform and take land back, 88% of which was held by white settler families. And the United States and other European nations were afraid that South Africa would do the same. Exactly, as a very small version of it is happening right now in South Africa, by the way. And immediately they responded with unilateral sanctions. So really the logic of punishment for liberation is something that's been is present throughout our history books. But the fact that President Trump now makes it says it exactly as it is, hopefully is a clarifying moment, perhaps not so much for the global south, but at least for the North Atlantic Alliance, which may certainly break.
Varsha, what are the next steps forward? What do you see as the biggest barriers to justice from pursuing these actions, and what's next for this group?
We put out a call now to every single nation and every single government of conscience to really join us in the defense of what we see as a defense of the international law and a defense really of humanity. We know that what's at stake are the foundational principles of the United Nations Charter that apply to every single nation of this world and enshrine rights for all peoples of the world to self-determination, ones that are being actively threatened right now more than ever before by Trump with his comments about annexation and buying and taking over of Gaza. So if there was urgency at the beginning of the Hague Group's formation, which, as I mentioned, was at the 1-year mark, I think that urgency has only escalated in the last couple of weeks with the comments that have been coming out of the White House. So now more than ever, we really need collective action from states, because while punishment against individual state can be quite a serious deterrent, that seriousness of that deterrent starts to go down as the number of nations standing together starts to go up, because eventually what the United States will find is when it starts to go and punish every single member of the Hague Group, it may find that it's isolating itself as the Hague Group engulfs the entire world and engulfs all of the continents that stand with Palestine, drawing a very clear line of the rest of the world standing on the right side of history, on the side of Palestine, and Israel and the United States finding themselves isolated. So for us at the Hague Group, it's an open invitation to all nations to join us in this commitment to international law and to building a legal order that does hold up the rule of law and justice for all peoples across the world.